Sigmund Freud counts among the most famous atheists in the history of Western thought. Certainly his fame comes primarily from his psychoanalytic exploits rather than anything explicitly related to the philosophy of religion, but you'd be remiss to suggest that his atheism hasn't had a considerable influence on the thought that followed him. His position comes at the end of something of a venerable heritage of atheism, stretching through the course of the long 19th century. Perhaps we could say beginning with the Enlightenment figures of Diderot and D'Holbach, before moving into the post-Hegelian turn with the likes of Strauss and Feuerbach and of course Marx. And then of course Schopenhauer requires mention, who in turn was a great influence on Nietzsche. Freud's own critique of theism claimed that God was nothing but a puerile projection, a childish desire for an omnipotent pater familias, a supremely powerful father figure who could afford you security, safety and comfort. And when transformed into organized or institutional religion, this became what he called a universal neurosis. In Totem and Taboo, Freud makes clear that the concept of God originated from a kind of ancestral ritual sacrifice and lingered as a kind of abstraction that was intended to enforce morality. Now, Freud's critique is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, I think it clearly fails as an argument against theism, committing the genetic fallacy. But also, at the same time, it seems generally correct in its assessment of how theism works, at least in a certain psychological capacity. Although it does nothing to actually argue against theism so much as provide a potential description of the psychological origin of theism, it does clearly identify certain qualities in the attitude that many believers do today and in past generations adopt in relationship to the God that they believe in. Most specifically, that is, the way in which God becomes an ultimate principle in order to enforce and legitimize morality. I want to highlight the way in which this contradiction, that is, between an abstract morality and an individual who is obliged to conform to it, seems to have been misconstrued as the center of religion. It seems in many cases that religion is presented as merely a set of rules on a sheet of paper that either you follow or you don't follow, and you are religious to the extent that you are capable of following those rules. But although there is a very important moral sense at the heart of many religions, and due to the institutional nature of the way human beings organize themselves, these morals often become systematized, it's very important that this is not mistaken for the essence of religiosity. And with respect to religious education, that is primarily to the relationship between religious parents and their children, the moment you start talking about God as though he were merely a thing in the world, like Freud's totem, an archetype, or a great symbol establishing moral legality and making you feel guilt or shame, a dictator, if you will, who instructs you to follow his laws, is the moment you start alienating people, especially young people, from that God. It is not without reason, I contend, hence my title, that teenagers raised in religious households tend to foster resentment toward the religion they are taught by their parents, resentment that often results in a transition to atheism. To speak of another famous atheist that I've already mentioned, Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality is a superb text which deals with these kinds of issues, amongst other things, especially the emergence of guilt and shame in the human psyche. In one section, Nietzsche describes two classes or castes of people, the aristocratic or noble, and the common or low, and explains that the division between good and bad was originally one which simply attributed goodness to nobility and badness to a failure to attain those noble attributes. But the dominance of this noble class and the impotence of the lower class to challenge them resulted in what Nietzsche called, using a French term, a ressentiment in the lower classes, who wish to overthrow their oppressors but don't have the, should we say, natural means to do so. This ressentiment or resentment later breeds what Nietzsche calls slave morality, the turning of good and bad on its head to become good and evil, The lower classes dictate to the upper classes what is permissible and what is not, and the dominion of the upper classes is claimed to be evil. Those who are trampled on by the powerful convince their enemies that they are doing something morally wrong, which is the only way by which those who are trampled on can get a foothold in the battle. Now, you don't have to agree with Nietzsche's central thesis here, as I certainly do not, in order to recognize that he's getting at something fairly fundamental in the formation of resentment. Namely, that it comes from a sense of being wronged and being powerless to do anything about it. It's derived from an utter disregard for your own feelings, intentions, and desires by an authority or agency that strips you of your own autonomy and essentially tramples on you. Within a religious context, if you are constantly subjected to a morality that tramples on your own autonomy and agency, rather than being a morality that emerges from yourself, or perhaps that you willingly accept through your own convictions, then you will come to resent what it stands for. This unfortunate dynamic is visible in the way in which young people are today reviling the religion taught to them by their parents. If you treat God as just a thing in the world, the king sitting atop his cosmic throne, judging the people below, you'll eventually come to resent that God for his dictatorship, just as people come to resent actual political dictators for their unkind and cruel abuses of authority. The problem lies, I believe, in a dualistic structure here that pits God and the believer against each other, as though God was something over and against them, and the two are locked in a battle where God insists upon his laws and the believer either has to get with them or get rid of them. And when an individual can't easily live up to those laws, they are flooded with shame, guilt, and debt, all things that Nietzsche analysed in his text. And I believe it is in this state of mind that we get the fertile soil for a lot of modern atheism. Now, what this video should not be misconstrued as is a kind of gotcha to atheists, an armchair psychoanalysis that supposedly renders their position null and void. Quite the opposite. It's in fact a criticism not of atheism at all, but of the particularly ignorant and sometimes even directly abusive ways in which religion is taught to young people who then become atheists. In many ways, in fact, I even feel inclined to celebrate teenage atheism as something of a genuinely mature development in the process of self-discovery of a young person. I find it very irritating, in fact, when religious adults will dismiss or write off teenage atheism as though it were just a phase and a complete exercise in ignorance. What this represents is yet another complete misunderstanding of the role that their bad teaching plays in alienating people from religion. The exodus of young people from all kinds of faiths should be recognized as an indication that there is something fundamentally wrong in the teaching of those faiths. Again, this isn't to suggest that atheism is simply a faulty psychological reaction and it doesn't have any sort of intellectual value on its own terms. I'm not saying that. But only that this particular brand of atheism, that is an atheism that is primarily psychologically charged, as most things are in those teenage years, very often happens to stand on a righteous rejection of certain religious doctrines that are inherently harmful to any human psychology. It's also not to say that religion should completely reject the moral systems of thou shalt and thou shalt not, although Nietzsche and Freud had different views on this, of course. These are ultimately indispensable, at least on a conventional day-to-day level, in the way that people go about their daily lives. There is a reason that the rebellious streak of the teenage years in any context, not just the religious, does burn out after a certain while. It's simply not sustainable. But what I think that rebellious streak in teenage atheism actually shows us is something that, to use a provocative word, is really a kind of revelation. It's something that allows you to advance in your relationship to God, even if conceptually you are moving, or you seem to be moving, away from him. After all, if you're raised in a fundamentalist household which convinces you that to be a Christian you need to abandon the theory of evolution, then you'll be a lot less likely to believe later in life, because That's a stupid thing to suggest. Vast swathes of religious people seem convinced that to be faithful is simply to stubbornly cling to a given set of dogmatic beliefs and violently reject their alternatives. This cultivates a strange pseudoscientific attitude that, again, alienates people and makes a mockery of intelligent faith. The same goes for militants who try to employ religion for the sake of violent ends, whether in the form of extreme exclusivist rhetoric or actual religious terrorism. In all cases, whether intellectual, spiritual, or emotional, it seems that contemporary religion creates its own enemies by the advertisement of harmful and ignorant beliefs. Beliefs which, I should mention, are in most cases unfaithful to the major traditions whence those religions hail. I'll provide a little reflection on what I think might be a turn for the better. Think about what draws young people to atheism, or indeed theism, or a political opinion, or a cultural take, or whatever it is that you happen to turn toward in teenage years. In all cases, it is a turn to autonomy, irrespective of the particular content of the belief that you have. In many cases, this is due to overbearing parents, or perhaps parents teaching overbearing ideas, which children want to throw off as they grow and develop and learn to choose things in the world for themselves. But the fact that we see teenagers going both ways, from theism to atheism and vice versa, depending on their own convictions and their own circumstances, should tell us that the value of this transition is not actually contained in the content itself. Rather, primarily, it is contained in the freedom that that idea brings. A certain personal dignity is afforded you when you're able to actually choose what you believe yourself, rather than simply being told with a finger wag to accept a moral code. So, to my mind, that is what people should focus on. The person themselves. It's clearly not the case that grand abstractions are exclusively relevant in themselves to whether or not people adopt them. People adopt beliefs, in many cases, because they feel a genuine personal conviction in them. So what we're talking about here is something that switches Freud's dualism on its head. God and the believer are not just two separate poles, like a king and his subject. Rather, their relationship is defined by, and this, of course, pertains to any morals or doctrines in that relationship, a sense of unity. All those aspects of the religious life suddenly no longer arise as overbearing yokes that you must take upon yourself and allow to quash any negative responses to them, but rather they arise as emanations from or reflections of an interior nature, sprouting from a certain harmony within yourself that then produces parameters and principles by which to live your life. If religion wishes to rehabilitate itself in the eyes of its skeptics, what it shouldn't be doing is sadly what it seems to be doing now, namely clamping down with ever more force on dissension, shifting ever further to the religious right, and so becoming increasingly intolerant and paranoid about the diversity of views that normally exist within and enriches a tradition. What should be emphasized by religion is not the arid, extrinsic, objective systematization of a set of morals, but the interiority of God to each believer. The fact that God is that ultimate reality that all creatures share. And so in prayer or liturgy or theology or morality even, we're not talking about some man in the sky who gets happy or angry with us depending on what we do or say. That would be a man against whom, and I'll reiterate this, eventually we would come to rebel out of resentment for the way that he disregards our own feelings and sentiments. Rather, we are talking about our very inner essence, the being that we are, the abiding and unchanging heart of awareness that remains as the rest of the world constantly arises and whiles away. Religion has suffered from an exteriorization. It's become a concept to either accept or reject, just another product on the shelf for the consumer to purchase or pass by. If we're looking for a rejuvenation of religion in an age when it seems in many cases to be on steep decline, then we must seek to reinvigorate the personal reality of that faith. Not just telling people what to do or what to believe, and arguing that they are religious to the extent to which they can conform themselves to that standard, but encouraging a unique and individual discovery of God as the ground and essence of all things. A discovery that will be as much toward God as it will be toward themselves, toward that essence that Augustine calls both superior summa meo and interior intimo meo. Because ultimately these two poles, creator and creation, share, when you peer closely and when you cease to be distracted by illusion, a beating heart of unity.